What is up, everyone? It feels like it's been so long since we sat down and chatted. I missed you. Hope you're doing well. From the bottom of Jack and my blackened hearts, we apologise that we missed an episode last week. Some of you may have noticed, some of you might not have. It's not like we're the be-all and end-all of your lives anywhere. If we are, thank you, that's very nice of you, but probably shouldn't be. But yeah, some of you may have noticed we had our 100th episode sort of thing, and we had the Toy Box Killer, which was the giant 2-hour and a bit podcast, and I combined the breakdown and the timeline of those two together, but then there should have been another episode out Monday just gone, like last Monday, but we were just so busy. We've been working on so much shit. We were going to try and squeeze out another one that we'd been working on, but it wasn't quite ready, and we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to give you some subpar bullshit that wasn't worthy of you wasting the time to listen to it, so we just held off, and we've been working on this episode for probably over a month now or something. Both bought books and read them. Great book, Hellship, Michael Veitch. Suggest you go buy it. It just came out this year. There's another book, Fever Beach, by Mary. I've forgotten her last name. The book's sitting just over there somewhere, but I'll put that up in the show notes and whatnot. We really liked this story and wanted to tell it, so apologies that we were a week behind, but we're back on schedule, yo. We just didn't want to give you some crap that, we'll just put something out for them to listen. Nah, you deserve better. You deserve the best. Only the best. So, enjoy, yo. Enjoy. Thanks to all of our listeners, Patreons, all that shit. We love you. Tell a friend, etc., etc. Search Carousel Sniper Victim. Buy some shit. You're the best. Love you.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
You're listening to Carousel Sniper Victim, a Dead Glass Design production, with your host, Sean Jeffrey.
This land is cursed. The animals hop, not run. The birds run, not fly. And the swans are black, not white. This land is cursed, and I'll have nothing more to do with it. From the logbook of explorer William Dampier as he sailed away from the Australian coast. To say the Robertson family was having a bad day on the 26th of October, 1852, would be a bit of an understatement. Having left their small homestead at Inverness, located in the northeast of Scotland a few months earlier, they now found themselves trapped, dying of disease aboard a floating, living nightmare, a literal plague ship. The Ticonderoga, a mighty 4-masted clipper ship painted jet black, had set sail nearly 4 months earlier from Birkenhead, England, bound for Australia, carrying around 900 passengers, mostly comprising of migrants, and of those migrants mostly Scottish Highlanders, seeking a new life in the, quote, lucky country. One by one, however, those families, such as the Robertsons, would watch their loved ones die, slowly. Right before their eyes, they would slip into the grips of violent and desperate hysteria before slipping into unconsciousness and never waking up again. On that tragic October day, Daniel Robertson and his wife Isabella, both aged 40, would die within hours of each other, leaving their 5 children to look after one another. A few days later, their youngest daughter Anne would join them. This just left their eldest daughter Mary, aged 18, to look after the now 3 remaining Robertson children. This scenario would become the norm for the passengers confined aboard the plague ship Ticonderoga. By the time this floating morgue limped into Port Phillip Bay, it would be flying the dreaded Yellow Jack, the yellow flag signalling other ships to stay clear, a flag of contagion. By the time this disastrous chapter in Australian maritime history came to a close, over 170 people would be dead. In July of 1851, Victoria's first gold rush began, and before the end of the year, gold fever had spread across Australia and beyond. Workers on Victoria's sheep farms, lured by tales of gold, abandoned their posts and went in search of their fortunes. In an effort to fill the resulting labour shortage, Britain's Emigration Commission was sponsoring emigrant families from Scotland, Ireland and England who wanted to seize the opportunity to become farm workers in Australia. On the 4th of August, 1852, in Birkenhead, 795 migrants, predominantly Highland Scots, boarded the vessel, the Ticonderoga. Due to this huge labour shortage in the Australian colonies brought about by the discovery of gold, and the relaxation of immigration rules regarding the number of children allowed to travel, thousands of immigrants clamoured for transport to Victoria. The Ticonderoga, the ship that would carry them to this new promised land, was a 4-masted American double-decker ship of 1,089 tonnes, and she was one of 4 of its kind hired by the Emigration Commission to carry emigrants to Australia that year. The Highland and Island Immigration Society was a charitable society formed to promote and assist immigration as a solution to the Highland potato famine. Between 1852 and 1857, it assisted the passage of around 5,000 immigrants from Scotland to Australia. The Society's work was both praised for providing a solution to the famine in Scotland, but also criticised for providing landlords with an easy mechanism for the Highland clearances. And now here I was going to go into a big in-depth history on the Highland clearances, but the episode ended up becoming a sort of episode of Game of Thrones. There's so many kings and princes and dukes and all this shit. All you really need to know is this when it comes to the Highland clearances. The Scottish people had lived the same sort of life, a subsistence life, since like time immemorial. You have to go, I was finding myself going all the way back to when the Romans left England, and then it was attacked by, the Anglo-Saxons, and then the Norman conquests and all of this, and the Scots and the English had just been fighting each other back and forth, and their bonny prince was killed. But basically all that matters is the Scottish people lived up in the Highland areas for years doing the same thing. They kept sheep. When it was the crazy, brutally cold winters, they'd bring their sheep down from the Highlands and they'd live with them, which the English and other people considered barbarous. So, with the invention of this new selectively bred Cheviot sheep, what was the point of having these peasants up there? The English could make, a lot more money, let's say, than if they had sheep everywhere than if they had Scottish peasants. So, the Highland clearances happened. At first, slow and oh, yep, here's an eviction notice, take down your house, and by the end of it, it was, don't even worry leaving, we'll just burn you alive in your house. It was some hectic shit, but basically, Cheviot sheep are worth more money than Scottish landowners and peasants, so they were all forcibly evicted to try and find either somewhere else to live, or if you want, we'll fund your passage to Australia. So that's where the Ticonderoga comes in, and these 800-odd Scottish immigrants who suddenly decide they all want to go to Australia because guess what? They've got fucking nothing left of their homeland because the English have ruined it. Just like the English have kicked out the Aborigines and ruined their life and completely oppressed them. The inevitable march of guns, germs and steel. The Ticonderoga was captained by Thomas H. Boyle and carried 48 crew, which included a Dr. J.C. Sanger as the surgeon superintendent, and his assistant surgeon, Dr. James William Henry Veitch, or Veitch. James William Henry Veitch, I'm going to say Veitch, was the great-great-grandfather of the author Michael Veitch and also Australian comedian Michael Veitch, whose book was an invaluable research aid. It's only just come out, it was the reason we basically did this topic. It's called Hell Ship, the true story of the plague ship Ticonderoga, one of the most calamitous voyages in Australian history. Along with that, there's a book called Fever Beach. Both of them are so good, I highly recommend reading both. So Michael Veitch, the author of Hell Ship, his great-great-grandfather was the assistant surgeon on board Hell Ship. While Dr. James William Henry Veitch was on board, he would meet Annie Morrison, who he would fall in love with and later marry, who is the great-great-grandmother of Michael Veitch. So there you go. After winning a contract to carry emigrants to Port Phillip in Victoria, Captain and part owner Thomas Boyle had the ship fitted out for its first and only voyage to Australia. The fit-out met and exceeded all existing regulations, with Captain Boyle adding additional facilities for the comfort of his passengers. He was a good guy, Captain Boyle, and he really did everything he thought it was in his power to give them the best chance at a good and safe voyage. The upper deck had the single women's area and a married area. The lower deck had another married area and the single men's area. Ship's officers and the crew had separate areas at each end of the upper deck, and the male hospital, female hospital, and men's ablution areas were all on the upper deck. Sanitation was good on the upper deck, but poor on the lower, where they only had what they would call, quote, night utensils. The official start of the journey for Highland Scots was when they made their way to the emigration office at Glasgow. From there they were transported over 350 k's down the UK west coast by packet steamers to the port at Liverpool. A ferry then took them across the Mersey River to the emigration depot at Birkenhead. While at the depot, every passenger underwent an inspection to ensure their suitability for travel and for work when they eventually reached Victoria and the Australian colonies. On board the Ticonderoga, the provisions for the journey included over 36,000 pounds of flour, 12,000 pounds of split peas, 93 cartons of sugar, over 6,000 pounds of raisins, barrels of navy bread, preserved beef and pork and canned soup, and over 400 gallons of pickles and 7,000 pounds of treacle, not to mention the 25,000 pounds of oatmeal and 3 chests of tea left over from the previous voyage the ship had taken. Under normal circumstances, the voyage should have been a relatively uneventful one, with passengers experiencing a wide range of weather conditions and the occasional bout of seasickness. They might have entertained one another with singing and dancing on the deck and reading out aloud to themselves or engaging in long conversations about home with fellow passengers. The most remarkable concern for the passengers should have been whether salted meat or pea soup were on the menu again. Instead, it was whether they would actually even survive the journey. Keep in mind, this wasn't some faraway ancient time. We're not talking about like the founding of Australia. This is 160-ish years ago, although that's not far off the founding of Australia anyway, but children of people that travelled on the Ticonderoga died as recently as the 1960s. These migrants were travelling in the new superboat of the age, the Clipper. The actual impact that Clippers had on international maritime trade during their high watermark, if you will, in maritime trade is seen in the numbers. Their chubby-cheeked and cumbersome predecessors struggled to exceed 150 nautical miles in a single day. But by the early 1850s, these newfangled clippers were leaving like a frothing white wake streaming behind. They'd cover over 250 nautical miles in a single day. Commercially, the timing of the clippers' emergence proved more providential than anyone could have imagined for trade. Yet, almost simultaneously, much broader opportunities transpired as a result. They could carry millions of passengers along maritime highways to the scene of the now two major 1850 gold rushes, one in the US out California way, and the other in Australia. They could now transfer these migrants from their home countries to emerging lands of hope and opportunity, or at least that was the idea. There were unforeseen problems associated with the double-decker aspect of the ship. Poor ventilation and lighting were the major two. As a result, washing the decks wasn't commonly practiced, as the water would leak from deck to deck and it was almost impossible to dry out what they would call the damp. The atmosphere between decks grew more and more polluted. The risk of disease was also heightened by a lack of space for exercise on the upper deck due to the overcrowding, along with poor personal hygiene and an aversion to medical treatment and an ignorance about the incubation of disease. There's no doubt that any infection or fever would thrive amongst such shitty sanitary conditions, and thrive is exactly what disease did. Dr. Sanger reported that disease had been noticed about 2 weeks after the ship's departure. Red rashes, strong delirium bordering on insanity, and the ever-present diarrhea and dysentery. So, what was it that was spreading so rapidly through this plague ship? Typhus. The first reliable description of the disease appears in 1489 AD, during the Spanish siege of Baza against the Moors during the War of Granada, 1482 to 1492. These accounts include descriptions of fever, red spots over the arms, back and chest, attention deficit progressing to delirium, as well as gangrenous sores and the associated smell of rotting flesh. During the siege, the Spaniards lost 3,000 men to the enemy, but an additional 17,000 men died of typhus. In historical times, jail fever or ariotitis fever was common in English prisons and is believed by modern authorities to have been typhus. It often occurred when prisoners were crowded together into dark, filthy rooms where lice could easily spread, just like the conditions aboard the Ticonderoga. One passenger described how up to 10 dead passengers were bundled up in bedding and mattresses at a time, and thrown overboard to float away. The route the Ticonderoga sailed took them down the west coast of Africa, then generally east to Victoria, but it's hard to describe in an audio medium. Like, you imagine the quickest point between two places is a straight line, and that's true if you're travelling in two-dimensional space, but we live on a round Earth. Don't come at me, flat earthers. On a round Earth, the quickest point between two spots isn't necessarily a straight line. They'd travel south from sort of, England, where they would leave, right along the coast of Africa, and the ship had crossed the equator, travelling from the warm tropics at the middle latitudes of the world, now into the freezing southern oceans, the roaring 40s and 50s with storms and icebergs and fogs in freezing Arctic regions. Raging epidemics of typhus and scarlet fever resulted in several deaths a day, every day. As families were trying to huddle together for warmth, they were unwittingly encouraged the spread of typhus. It wasn't known until 50 years later that it was transmitted by body lice. So trying to squeeze together to get warm is just making the disease spread even worse. By the end of October, over 300 passengers and crew were sick with a variety of illnesses. The hospitals had overflowed, medical supplies had run out, and the two doctors were exhausted, with Dr. Sanger showing typhus symptoms now himself. 6 days after the death of Daniel and Isabella Robertson, on the 1st of November, after 90 days at sea, Land Ahoy was called from the crow's nest. The sense of relief and hope that must have been spread amongst the crew would have just been overwhelming. The Ticonderoga crawled into Port Phillip Bay flying that dreaded yellow flag and carrying the stench of death. The port and harbour master at Williamstown, Captain Charles Ferguson, reported that, quote, 100 deaths and 19 births had occurred on the passage, 7 of the former since the ship anchored at the heads. There are at present 300 cases of sickness amongst them, principally scarlatina, or scarlet fever. There were in fact 311 cases of fever, which was actually typhus, upon the ship's arrival. The report given by the Immigration Board in Melbourne to the Emigration Commissioners on the condition of the Ticonderoga on its arrival stated that, quote, the ship, especially the lower part, was in a most filthy state, and did not appear to have been cleaned for weeks. The stench was overpowering. The lockers, so thoughtlessly provided for the immigrants' use, were full of dirt, mouldy bread, and suey full of maggots. Regardless of how filthy the ship was, she had finally arrived at Port Phillip's Heads. But the drama was far from over. 2 days later, the Ticonderoga was moved to what is now known as Ticonderoga Bay on Point Nepean, the site of a proposed quarantine station. This place was chosen to drop anchor due to fears of taking so many people with a deadly disease on to the city of Melbourne. With no facilities other than what they had brought with them on the ship, the mammoth task of evacuation began by moving the sick and dying to makeshift shelters on the beach. Urgent messages were relayed to officials in Melbourne, and before long, supplies began to arrive by land and sea. Arriving with the first supplies the following day was a Dr. Taylor, who had accepted the offer of taking charge of the situation and, in doing so, was now in charge of establishing a quarantine station. Over the following weeks, all passengers and their belongings were moved to the beach. Cooking and sanitation facilities were set up, and the ship was stripped completely and cleaned. A second hospital ship was now established as well. It was hot though, so bodies were buried quickly. The able-bodied started to work on parts of the new quarantine station. Schooling was established, and every effort was made to occupy the large number of increasingly restless passengers. I mean, there was nothing to do but sit and wait, hope to not catch the fever and die, which a further 68 people would do during their quarantine on the beach in Port Phillip. On Sunday, the 19th of December, 1852, when he was satisfied all crew were fully recovered, Dr. Hunt, the health officer of Port Phillip, gave the all-clear for the Ticonderoga to be released from her quarantine. On the morning of Wednesday the 22nd of December, a few days later, the ship left Point Nepean, now finally arriving at Hobson's Bay later that day, although most of the passengers arrived without one or more of their family members. They were greeted by a settlement with few of the comforts of home, and a sense of despair from other new arrivals. It was an uncivilized country with its hot sun, dust, mosquitoes, and flies. The accommodation shortage, expensive food, and burgeoning crime were the civilized features. It must have been overwhelming after already sacrificing so much. All they could do was make the best of the shitty situation and try and build something out of nothing for themselves. And they weren't alone with their loss. Tragedy had also struck on the double-decker ships the Bourneuf, Marco Polo and Wanata that same year. The Bourneuf lost 88 of its passengers on the voyage, 83 of whom were children. The Marco Polo lost 52 passengers, which 46 of whom were children. The Wanata lost 39 passengers, 30 of which being children. Scaremongering on the wharves meant that no one would row them to shore for 2 more days. They just had to sit out there on the boat waiting until someone finally decided to rock up and charge them a shitload of money to sail them over to the actual port. The first passengers were taken the 12 kilometres to Queen's Wharf on the Friday 24th, Christmas Eve. by then making their way to the immigration barracks near the corner of Spencer and Collins Street. Their journey had officially ended. The immigration barracks also served as a labour exchange. The single women were employed straight away, and most of the others found well-paid work fairly quickly. However, by mid-February, there still remained in the barracks 30 widows, orphans, and unplaced families. The tragic loss of life did not go unnoticed, and the Immigration Commission made the decision not to use double-decker vessels in the future. It also reintroduced the policy whereby no family would be accepted for emigration in which there were more than 2 children under 7 years or 3 children under the age of 10. Eventually, the whole story did close, and that was the end of one of the most disastrous chapters in Australian maritime history, but the tale of the Ticonderoga still continues to intrigue people up until now. Hellship has only just been published, and it's now going around as a stage show production in Australia, but one of the newspapers that would have been commonly read by people of that age was the Argus. The Argus ran an interesting article in the late 1930s about the Ticonderoga. The Argus Weekend magazine of June 17, 1939. The article was titled, "The Tragic Name of Ticonderoga. Eerie Coincidences Link an Australian Plague Ship, a Scottish Crime, and an American Disaster." The article reads as follows. In the summer of 1852, a 4-masted ship dropped anchor inside Port Phillip's Heads, flying the yellow flag that speaks a warning in all languages. The convalescent passengers were put ashore to accommodate themselves as best they could on a peninsula then as deserted as Robinson Crusoe's island. The sick remained on board, and although fresh food supplies and medical assistance presently arrived by the government schooner from Williamstown, their misery may be imagined. The summer of 1852 was notably hot. 100 passengers had died during the voyage, and in the next few weeks 78 graves were dug on the sandy peninsula to receive further victims of the fever, chiefly Scots and Highlanders, their wives and children, and members of a few families from northern English counties. The ship was a giant of the days of sail. Her home port was New York, but she had crossed to Liverpool to share in the lucrative passenger trade arising from gold discoveries in the Port Phillip district. The name upon her bows was Ticonderoga, an American Indian word meaning musical waters. A 100 years earlier, when Britain and France struggled for supremacy about the Great Lakes of North America, Ticonderoga, now part of New York State, was the scene of a French entrenchment and a British attack repulsed with heavy casualties. The old Highland Regiment, later the famous 42nd, lost 500 men in a few hours of desperate struggle. The name Ticonderoga acquired a mournful significance in British regimental history, and the strange and interesting legend of Ticonderoga was added to the folklore of Clan Campbell. Major Duncan Campbell of Inverell marched that day with his regiment through the American backwoods towards an unknown objective. Though his years were only 55, he could look back upon an adventurous military career and also upon some rather strange psychic experiences. A few years earlier, he had raised a regiment and vigorously assisted the government against the Jacobite rising of the 45, carrying fire and sword even among members of this clan who opposed the government. In a perilous situation, he unexpectedly received protection from a Jacobite outlaw who proved to be a kinsman, one Donald Campbell of Lorne. Sometime after the restoration of peace, Donald of Lorne was attacked upon the stepping stones of a river crossing by a cowardly assailant and murdered. Duncan Campbell, enjoying a well-earned leave from his military duties, received the news of the murder at his estate at Inverell, and by a strange coincidence, had the murderer in his power. Every clan tradition demanded that he should avenge his kinsman's death, but while he hesitated between old loyalties and newer ideals, the guilty man escaped. That night, Duncan Campbell was visited by a startling apparition. Donald of Lorne stood before him, showed his blood-stained plaid and exclaimed reproachfully, "My murder is unavenged. Farewell, Inverore, till we meet again at Ticonderoga." Ticonderoga? Nobody in Scotland had heard of such a place. Major Campbell related his experience to some of his brother officers, but the strange name remained an unknown quantity through several years. Even as they marched that day upon the fatal entrenchment, their commanding officer spoke of it by the French name of Fort Carousel. It was only on the eve of the attack that Major Campbell, rendered uneasy by a presentiment. Some accounts say that he saw himself mortally wounded crossing a stream in the woods. He asked of a scout if the place had another name, and received the reply, "Yes, the old Indian name for the place is Ticonderoga." This strange story of a dream and its fulfillment was widely circulated, and its truth attested by Major Campbell's brother officers and relatives. Francis Parkman, a well-known historian, included this story in his important works titled Montcalm and Wolfe. He gives the facts as he received them from one Dean Stanley, who had corresponded on the subject with a later Laird of Inverore, third in succession to Duncan Campbell himself. Its conclusion is known to the tourists who visit the old lakeside cemetery at Lake George, New York State, and there they read a faded epitaph. Here lies the body of Duncan Campbell of Inverore, Major of the old Highland Regiment, aged 55 years, who died July 17th, 1758, of wounds received at the attack on the entrenchment of Ticonderoga. A tablet has of recent years been placed in a nearby library to commemorate the bravery of the 500 Highlanders who fell that day, but no trace of their burial place remains. Perhaps in another 100 years there will be as little to memorialise the 178 Highland settlers who died on the fever ship called by the same unhappy name. At the time of the article being written, there was only presently 3 graves that remained there, inscribed, "In memory of W.M. Henry Boyle, late 3rd officer of the ship Ticonderoga of New York, Adam Moffat, steward of the ship Ticonderoga, and saddest of all, monument to 100 similar family tragedies that have no memorial." Today, the bay between Observatory Point and Police Point on the Nepean Peninsula bears the name of Ticonderoga, and a memorial to those who lost their lives on this ill-fated vessel lies in the Point Nepean Cemetery. Perhaps the most stirring piece of writing from any work to mention the Ticonderoga story, in my opinion anyway, is the dedication in the opening pages of Michael Veitch's absorbing book on the subject, Hellshit. He writes as a dedication, "Dedicated to the boat people, from every land and every era."
Campbell left his homeland to fight across the sea, troubled by a vision that wove his destiny. He would remain there, came a warning from the dead. Ticonderoga, it sang within his head. Ticonderoga, meeting of the water, land of great beauty where many still lay. Ticonderoga, war pipes echo over, ghosts of Highland men who fought fateful day. In a green and wooded place, the land of painted men, Campbell dreamt the dream of his fate again. The pibroch gave a warning from the dead. Ticonderoga, it sang within his head. Ticonderoga, meeting of the water, land of great beauty where many still lay. Ticonderoga, war pipes echo over, ghosts of Highland men who fought that fateful day. In the dawning new world light came the sound of war. Clansman's steel was burning bright on that bloody shore. Duncan Campbell fell this day, as fate foretold to be. Ticonderoga, his place of destiny.